The year was 1884, and the land was a cruel altar upon which the sun sacrificed the sky each day, bleeding heat onto the cracked earth. For Eleanor Vance, the cruelty was not confined to the landscape. It rode beside her, wore a man's face, and answered to the name of her husband, Garrett. Their wagon, a vessel of dwindling hope, had finally surrendered, its axles split like a dry bone. They were stranded in the vast, indifferent emptiness of the Arizona Territory, miles from any settlement they could name. Useless, Garrett had snarled, kicking the splintered wheel. The word was not for the wagon. It was for her. It was always for her. For 2 years his love had curdled into a possessive contempt that clung to her like the dust. He blamed her for the failed venture in Prescott, for the lame horse, for the relentless sun itself. Eleanor had learned to absorb the venom of his words, to build a small, quiet space inside herself where he could not reach. She stood a little ways off, her calico dress faded and sticking to her skin, her gaze fixed on the shimmering horizon. Thirst was a living thing in her throat. Garrett had been rationing the water for 3 days, his sips long and mocking, hers barely enough to wet her lips. He watched her now, his eyes narrowed slits in his sunburnt face. Don't just stand there like a half-wit. Make yourself useful. Find some brush for a fire. Not that there's anything left to cook. Obedience was a reflex, a mechanism for survival. Eleanor turned from the ruin of their wagon and walked toward a sparse gathering of mesquite and brittlebush. The ground radiated heat through the thin soles of her boots. The silence out here was profound, broken only by the buzz of an unseen insect and the rustle of her own skirts against the scrub. It was in this silence that she allowed herself a flicker of a forbidden thought. Freedom, a life where the only harshness was the sun, the only judgment, the vastness of the sky. She bent to pick up a piece of dried mesquite, her fingers brushing against the hot, sandy soil. As she straightened, a movement at the edge of her vision, coiled and tight, drew her eye. Before a coherent thought could form, before a scream could build in her lungs, there was a sharp, piercing pain in her left ankle. It was a pain like 2 needles of fire being driven into her flesh. She stumbled back, a choked cry escaping her lips, and looked down. A diamond-patterned snake, its rattle a furious, dry hiss, was already slithering away into the meager shade of a rock. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She clutched her ankle, a wave of nausea rolling through her. The 2 small puncture wounds were already beginning to weep a thin, clear fluid. Garrett. Her voice was thin, stolen by terror. Garrett, help me. He came jogging over, his expression one of annoyance rather than concern. What is it now, woman? Seen a ghost? She pointed a trembling finger at her leg. A snake. It bit me. Garrett stopped. He stared down at her ankle, his eyes tracing the faint wounds. For a long moment, he said nothing. Eleanor watched his face, searching for any sign of alarm, of husbandly duty, of simple human pity. She found none. Instead, a slow, calculating stillness settled over his features. The annoyance was gone, replaced by something she had never seen before, something cold and appraising. It was the look of a man weighing an opportunity. "A rattler?" he asked, his voice strangely calm. She nodded, tears finally breaking free and tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "Please, Garrett, you have to do something. Cut it, suck the poison." She was babbling the half-remembered remedies she'd heard men discuss. He looked from her ankle to the endless, empty horizon and then back to her face. A slow, cruel smile touched the corner of his mouth. It did not reach his eyes. "I suppose I could," he said softly. He then knelt, but not to help her. He reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the small silver locket her mother had given her, his only concession to her sentimentality. He pocketed it. "What are you doing?" she whispered, a new, more profound horror dawning. Garrett stood up, dusting off his knees. "You've been nothing but a millstone around my neck, Eleanor, a bad luck charm." I figure this is the land's way of finally cutting me loose." He walked back to the wagon, gathered the last canteen of water and the small sack of their remaining funds. He didn't even glance back. "Garrett, no," she screamed, the sound raw and desperate. "You can't just leave me, Garrett." He didn't falter. He simply began walking east, his figure shrinking against the enormity of the landscape until he was just a dark speck, and then nothing at all. The silence he left behind was heavier than before, filled with the frantic drumming of her own heart and the furious rising throb in her leg. The sun beat down, indifferent. The land held its breath. Eleanor Vance was alone, left to die. Amos Blackwood understood the language of solitude. It was spoken in the cry of a hawk circling his isolated ranch, in the sigh of the wind through the eaves of his small cabin, in the weary creak of his own bones at the end of a long day. For 5 years, since consumption had stolen his Martha, silence had been his only steady companion. His life was a set of rigid routines: mend the fence, check the well, tend the stock. It was a life walled in by memory and loss, and he had long ago accepted its quiet austerity. He was riding the southern line of his property, tracking a calf that had wandered off, when he saw her. She was not a part of the landscape he knew. He first mistook her for a strange, crumpled shadow beneath a palo verde tree. Curiosity, a feeling he rarely indulged, pulled him closer. It was a woman, sprawled on the ground, one arm flung over her face as if to ward off the brutal sun. He dismounted, his movements cautious. Bandits sometimes used decoys, but as he drew near, he saw the unnatural stillness of her form, the way her dress was torn and stained with dirt. Her face, when he gently moved her arm, was pale and clammy, her lips tinged with blue. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. His gaze traveled down her body and stopped at her left leg. It was grotesquely swollen, the flesh angry and discolored, a violent purple that crept past her knee. And there, on her ankle, he saw them. The 2 dark punctures, the unmistakable signature of a Crotalus. He felt a jolt, a surge of something that broke through the calm surface of his solitude. It was a feeling of urgent, protective fury. Fury at the snake, at the merciless land, at whoever had left her here to suffer this fate. There was no time for deliberation. He knew the folk remedies were a desperate gamble, a prayer against a potent poison, but they were the only prayer he had. Working with a grim economy of motion, he pulled the Bowie knife from the sheath on his belt. The steel was cool and familiar in his hand. He knelt beside her, his heart pounding a heavy, unfamiliar rhythm against his ribs. He whispered an apology to the unconscious woman, or perhaps to the memory of his wife, before making 2 small, shallow cuts over the bite marks, just enough to break the skin. He lowered his head, pressed his mouth to her flesh, and drew. The taste was acrid, metallic, vile. He spat the venom-laced blood onto the parched ground, the glob turning dark in the dust. He repeated the action, again and again, his mind a blank slate of pure, desperate focus. He worked until his own head swam, until the poison he tasted was a phantom on his tongue. He knew it wasn't a cure, it was just a chance, a flicker of light against an encroaching darkness. When he could do no more, he rinsed his mouth with the last of the water from his canteen, pouring a few precious drops over her cracked lips. She moaned, a sound so faint it was nearly lost to the wind. With a strength born of necessity, he lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile burden. He settled her in front of him on the saddle, her head lolling against his chest, and turned his horse, spurring it toward the distant silhouette of his cabin. It was a race against the poison, against the sun, against the death that was already staking its claim on the woman in his arms. For 3 days, the world was a fever dream of fragmented images and disembodied sounds for Eleanor. She was burning, adrift on a sea of fire. She felt cool cloths on her forehead, the gentle pressure of a spoon at her lips, the taste of thin, savory broth. A deep voice murmured nearby, words she couldn't grasp, but the tone was steady, a low anchor in the storm of her delirium. She mumbled about Garrett, about a broken wagon, about the coldness in his eyes. She cried out at the memory of the snake, her body jerking with phantom pain. Through it all, Amos was a constant, tireless presence. He moved about the small two-room cabin with a quiet efficiency. He brewed willow bark tea to fight the fever. He bathed her swollen leg in cool water, changing the poultices of crushed herbs he prepared from Martha's old garden. He sat by her cot through the long nights, watching the rise and fall of her chest, his own exhaustion a dull ache behind his eyes. He listened to her fevered ramblings and felt a slow-burning anger solidify in his gut. The name Garrett became synonymous with a kind of evil he could barely comprehend. On the morning of the fourth day, the fever broke. Eleanor awoke to the scent of wood smoke and coffee. Her mind felt clear, scoured clean, but her body was a territory of profound weakness. She turned her head and saw him. He was standing by the stone fireplace, his back to her, a broad-shouldered silhouette against the morning light. He was stirring something in a pot. She tried to speak, but her voice was a dry rasp. "Hello?" He turned, startled. His face was weathered, carved with lines of sun and sorrow, but his eyes were a clear, steady grey. They held a guarded kindness. He walked over to the cot, a cup of water in his hand. "Easy now," he said, his voice the same low rumble she'd heard in her dreams. He helped her sit up, propping pillows behind her back. "You've had a rough go of it." She drank the water greedily. It was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. She looked down at her leg, propped on a stool. The swelling had gone down, though the skin was still a mottled canvas of purple and yellow bruises. The wound on her ankle was clean, bandaged with a strip of white cloth. You found me." "By the palo verde tree," he confirmed, his gaze direct. "Rattler got you." The memory washed over her, sharp and terrible. Garrett's face, the glint of the sun on the stolen locket, his back as he walked away. A sob caught in her throat. She pressed her lips together, fighting it back. She would not cry in front of this stranger. She had no tears left. He seemed to understand. He didn't press her for details. He simply nodded toward the fireplace. "Broth is ready. You need to get your strength back." And so began their quiet coexistence. Her world shrank to the four walls of his cabin and the small patch of ground visible from the window. The man, Amos Blackwood, was a creature of few words. Their conversations were sparse, functional exchanges about food, water, and her recovery. He would tell her, "Leg looks better today," and she would reply, "It feels it." He'd leave a bowl of stew on the small table by her cot and retreat to the other side of the room, giving her space. Yet, in his silence, there was a profound language of care. He had mended the tear in her dress with small, clumsy stitches. He left a book of poems by Martha's side of the bed for her to read. He never once made her feel like a burden. He treated her with a deep, almost formal respect that was so alien to her, it felt like a dream. As her strength returned, Eleanor began to take tentative steps, first around the cabin, then out onto the porch. She watched him work. He moved with a kind of deep-rooted competence, his hands sure as he repaired a harness or chopped wood. He was a man who belonged to this land, who understood its rhythms and demands. He was the complete antithesis of Garrett, who had only ever sought to conquer and exploit it, and had failed at both. One afternoon, she found the courage to contribute. She took the basket of his mending and sat on the porch, her needle moving with a practiced skill that surprised even her. He returned from the fields, stopped on the steps, and simply watched her for a moment. "My Martha," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She could mend anything, seemed to think she could mend the whole world with a needle and thread. It was the first time he had spoken of his wife by name, the first crack in the wall of his solitude. Eleanor looked up from her work, meeting his gaze. "It's a good skill to have," she said quietly. Some things need mending." He nodded, a flicker of understanding passing between them. He sat on the step below her, the silence stretching out, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not empty, it was shared. The fragile bridge of trust, built plank by plank with quiet gestures and unspoken empathy, was beginning to feel solid beneath their feet. Weeks turned into a month. The bruises on Eleanor's leg faded to a pale yellow, and she could walk without a limp. The ranch became her sanctuary, a place of healing. She took over the cooking, her meals a small offering of gratitude. She tended the small vegetable patch Martha had planted, coaxing green life from the dry soil. She and Amos fell into a comfortable domestic rhythm, a partnership forged in the ashes of their separate griefs. The memory of Garrett receded, becoming a ghost story she told only to herself in the dead of night. She began to feel a sense of home, a feeling she realized she had never truly known. It wasn't in the walls of the cabin, but in the steadfast presence of the man who occupied it with her, in the safety she felt when his shadow fell across the doorway at dusk. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sky bruise into nightfall, she finally found the words. "He left me to die," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My husband. He saw the bite and he just walked away." Amos didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the horizon, his jaw tight. "I figured as much," he said, his voice a low growl. "Some men aren't men at all." He was silent for a long time. Then he turned to her, his grey eyes holding hers. "He won't ever hurt you again. I won't let him." It wasn't a romantic declaration. It was a statement of fact, a promise. And in the vast, quiet expanse of the West, under a canopy of 1,000,000 stars, Eleanor believed him. She had been found not just in the desert, but in the quiet heart of a good man. The peace they had cultivated was as fragile as a desert bloom. It was shattered one hot Tuesday by the arrival of a buggy, kicking up a plume of dust that was visible for miles. Amos saw it first from the barn. His body went rigid. Visitors were a rarity. Unannounced visitors were a threat. He walked toward the cabin, his hand resting near the Colt Peacemaker on his hip. Eleanor came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her face etched with a familiar dread. As the buggy drew closer, she recognized the man holding the reins. It was Mr. Shaw, the sheriff from Jericho, the nearest town, some 30 miles east, and sitting beside him, looking smug and proprietary, was Garrett Vance. The sight of him stole the air from her lungs. He looked cleaner, better fed. He wore a new shirt. He had clearly prospered from her death. A cold fury, an emotion she had suppressed for years, rose up in her. The buggy stopped. Sheriff Shaw, a portly man with a weary expression, climbed down. "Amos," he said with a nod. His eyes flickered to Eleanor, a hint of confusion in them. Garrett disembarked with a flourish, a practiced smile plastered on his face. "Eleanor, my love, my darling wife, thank God you are safe." He started toward the porch, his arms outstretched. Amos moved without thinking, placing himself between Garrett and the steps. "That's far enough, Vance." Garrett's smile tightened. "Mr. Blackwood, I am in your debt. As I told the sheriff, I was attacked by Apaches. I was knocked unconscious and left for dead. When I came to, my wagon was gone, my wife vanished. I have spent weeks searching for her, fearing the worst." His performance was seamless, his voice filled with feigned relief and sorrow. "He's lying," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady, clear, imbued with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She looked directly at the sheriff. "There were no Apaches. My husband abandoned me after I was bitten by a rattlesnake. He left me to die." The sheriff looked from Eleanor's resolute face to Garrett's indignant one. "Now, ma'am," he began, clearly uncomfortable. "That's a serious accusation. Your husband here registered you as deceased. He seemed mighty broken up about it." "He is a fine actor," Eleanor stated flatly. "Ask him where my mother's locket is, the one he took from my pocket as I lay on the ground, dying." Garrett's mask of civility began to crack. A vein pulsed in his temple. "She's delirious," "The fever, Sheriff, it's addled her mind. This man has clearly taken advantage of her condition. She is my wife. By law, she belongs with me, and I am here to take her home." He made a move to push past Amos, to grab Eleanor's arm. Amos didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need to. He simply stood his ground, an immovable object. His body was tense, a coiled spring of protective instinct, but his voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. "She's not going anywhere with you." The three words hung in the hot, still air. They were a line drawn in the dust, a declaration of war. "She is my property," Garrett snarled, his true nature finally erupting through the veneer of charm. "The law says so." "The law doesn't give a man the right to leave his wife for buzzard food," Amos countered, his grey eyes like chips of flint. "You can tell the sheriff whatever story you want, but you will not lay a hand on her. You will not take her from this place." The confrontation had reached its peak. It was not a battle of guns, but of wills. Sheriff Shaw looked at Eleanor, standing tall and defiant on the porch, her gaze unwavering. He looked at Garrett, his face twisted with rage and thwarted possession. And he looked at Amos Blackwood, a quiet, solitary man who was now willing to stand against the law, and a dangerous man for the sake of this woman. The truth of the situation settled in his gut, heavy and undeniable. "Vance," the sheriff said, his voice taking on a new, hard edge. "Mr. Blackwood is right. You'll not be taking her. In fact, I think you and I need to have a long talk about filing a false report, and fraud, and maybe attempted murder." The color drained from Garrett's face. The fight went out of him, replaced by the panicked look of a cornered rat. He stammered, protested, but the sheriff was resolute. The law, which Garrett had tried to use as his weapon, had turned against him. He was escorted back to the buggy, his threats and curses fading as the vehicle turned and retreated down the long, dusty track, disappearing the same way it had arrived. Silence descended once more upon the ranch, but it was a new kind of silence, cleansed and peaceful. The threat was gone. Eleanor slowly sank onto the porch step, the strength that had held her up finally giving way to a profound sense of relief. Amos turned and sat beside her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid, comforting weight. They sat for a long time, watching the dust settle, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch reasserting themselves. "It's over," she said, more to herself than to him. "Yes," he agreed. She looked at her hands, resting in her lap. They were no longer the hands of the woman Garrett had tried to break. They were strong, capable, stained with the good earth from Martha's garden. She looked up at Amos. His face was calm, the tension gone, but his eyes held a question. The question of what came next. "Amos," she began, her voice soft, "I have nowhere to go." "I know," he said. He finally looked at her, and in his gaze she saw the depth of his loneliness and the hope that had begun to take root there. "Eleanor," he said, speaking her name as if it were a prayer. "You don't need somewhere to go. You're already home." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of gratitude. She reached out, her hand tentatively covering his. His skin was rough, calloused, but his touch was gentle as he turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. The harsh land, the place of her abandonment and near death, had become a place of rebirth. In the heart of its unforgiving beauty, two solitary souls, scarred by their pasts, had found not just survival, but sanctuary. They had found it in the shared quiet, in the steadfast care, and in the simple, profound truth of a hand held in the fading light. They had found it in each other.